Okay, so obvious, well, not as obvious starting time, but a good place to start maybe would be a sort of quick review of what happened in 2023 in the data. I mean, clearly a lot, but if you can summarize some of the main sort of developments, trends, etc., as to what happened in the data center industry across the world during
Yeah,
2023.
yeah, absolutely. Well, rather than go to the most obvious and largest topic first, why don't we come to that last? So I think 2023 was a really interesting year, and it seems like we're going to have interesting year followed by interesting year as we go forward. I think one of the things we saw last year, which everybody in the data center industry let's say felt the impact of, but are still trying to figure out exactly what the long-term impact is going to be. For example, is the new German energy efficiency regulation, which puts some, let's say, hard requirements around a sort of minimum level of heat reuse from data centers, which is a very positive thing in terms of that sort of waste energy source. But that will, have an impact on where data centers look for their locations in Germany, and the ability, for third parties to make use of that waste heat. It set a cap on PUE of 1.2 for the longer term operation of facilities, and a number of other things. So there were and indeed there were many other developments in sort of the regulatory and legislation in Europe. And I'll focus in Europe, otherwise we'll spend far too long just answering the first question of what happened in 23. But perhaps if we go to the other big topic of last year, which is this wave of AI demand that everybody was talking about. I think there was a lot of talk last year around when this might impact, how it might impact, how it might change the requirements and potentially even the design of data centers, the location of data centers. And perhaps for some geographic sort of context here, I think as is usually the case in this sector, the US probably saw the most activity around understanding what that sort of demand profile looks like. I think we've had conversations, buyers and suppliers of capacity in Europe here around that, what that might look like, but that, as again, typically lags the US by 18, 24, sometimes even longer months. But certainly that is the big topic that we were all figuring out in 2023. Okay, what do our plans for 24 need to look like if indeed, even a fraction of this new demand comes along? How are we going to deal with it as an industry?
Okay, and you've referenced the States there. And in terms of what we're seeing in the States, because as you say, I think in the data centers, often what happens there then filters over to Europe. Is the AI, and as you say, the sort of people scratching their heads slightly, is that the main thing, or are there any other sort of bits and pieces that the US is already getting to grips with, which we can anticipate coming over?
I think that is by far the dominant topic. It creates because of the scale of the demand signals that we're seeing. It adds to the challenge of sourcing power and sourcing renewable power. So there is also a discussion going on in the industry around, well, how do we generate the power required for these larger and larger facilities? How do we do that in a way that's sustainable? How do we do that in a way that is not taking energy away from other activities, particularly in metropolitan areas where you have homes and commerce and businesses? So I think while there is already topics around longer term sources of generation, nuclear SMRs is a big topic in the US at the moment. AI has just added to, let's say, the intensity of some of those topics and the real need for, where does this power come from over the next 10, 20 years?
Yeah, and in terms of AI, I mean, do you, at one end, I mean, I read an Uptime report, I think, that suggested that the explosion might not be as quick as people thought, just because there's a shortage of AI chips, so there's a bit of a bottleneck. And at the other end of the spectrum, as you say, everyone says that, it's going to take over the world. So where do you put yourself in those sort of two extremes? What do does anyone actually know, I suppose, what's likely to happen, or is it all sort of best guess scenarios?
There's a lot of crystal ball gazing going on, because it has the potential. And I believe, certainly all the research that I've done, and I've been, it's a topic I've been interested in for a long, long time. There's been a fundamental shift in the technology that we're now seeing, which is why you can have a very convincingly human conversation, with your iPhone, on the other end of which, in a data center, is a large language model. Very convincing. I mean, it still surprises me on a daily basis. And this is one tiny use case, for this technology. And so, I think I think it will live up to a lot of the hype. I think it will also require some time to sort of fully realize the potential of AI, let's say, being inserted into, for want of a better term, existing applications, and net new applications that would not otherwise be possible without things like large language models and other types of AI systems. So yes, there's a lot of hype. The numbers are very large. We are starting certainly this year. I have some data points, most of which are confidential, unfortunately, but data points from the market that validate, certainly in the US, that the talk and the search for capacity is now materializing into actual contracts. Those contracts obviously then turn into actual facilities, which get filled with actual GPUs, and then you're sort of off to the races. But I think in Europe, again, we will see that probably start to become more material, probably towards the end of this year, and then definitely into next year.
Okay, and everyone talks about AI, well, to a large extent, as if it's just one sort of thing. But as I understand it, there's two potential big areas. There's the large language models you've explained, which need massive data centers, banks and banks of servers doing all the number crunching, if you like. But we're also, I think, edge AI has potential, and I know the edge, we can have a separate conversation about that, but I mean, it's been talked about for quite a while as being a potentially killer app, and it hasn't got there. But at some stage, potentially, there's going to be the need for a whole load new, more new, smaller facilities at the edge, whatever people might define as it. Did you see those as being equally important, or do you think the large language models will just dominate regardless?
Well, just to be clear, I think irrespective of, let's say, the AI technology, right, whether it's a large language model or some other form of AI, it really falls into, let's say, two elements or two stages. One is the training of the model stage, and the other is when it's actually being used, which we refer to as inference. So you've got training and you've got inference. And the requirements are slightly different in terms of the data center locations, the data center capacities, and so on. So while a model is being trained, there is a requirement for a large number of nodes, GPUs essentially, to be co-located closely together, with high bandwidth connectivity between them, and time to chunk through massive amounts of data on which those models are trained. So, there's a less of a focus in that training phase on that physically being proximate to any end users, because that's, if you like, while the model is still developing its capabilities, so it's not being used at that stage, and that it sort of opens up the opportunity to find large amounts of space, power, at lower power costs from sustainable power sources in regions that are, far away from the populous areas and far away from the end users. Certainly the potential to do that. And over the longer term, scaling up the factories, if we can call them that train these AI models, they would arguably be better located in those more remote locations with access to, sustainable renewable power and so on. In the inference phase, there is the very strong requirement around data sovereignty, particularly as let's say more B2B and specialized models come around, that companies put their own most precious data in to fine tune those models and to get the benefits, really tuned to their business needs. And businesses are naturally and legislatively quite often required to have very strict control and access to where that data resides. So data sovereignty becomes the critical side of inference. And I think that's where your comment about edge data centers, right? If we define edge data centers, given there are so many interpretations of what edge means, from my perspective, it's edge of the network, which means being proximate to the users, the consumers of that data, and sometimes also the sources of that data. So yes, I do see a need for more data centers in sovereign locations to meet that sovereign data requirement, to meet that data sovereignty requirement. I don't necessarily think they're small. So one of the attributes that was associated with edge, certainly in the past, that these were very small locations and there were many of them and they were highly distributed. That's still a potential use case, looking for problems to solve. I think with AI, those locations still are going to be quite sizable in terms of, the physical size and the number of megawatts that these data centers consume.
And in terms of, we'll follow up the data sovereignty in a second, but in terms of the actual requirements for data centers, in terms of design, construction, operation, do you think the industry is fully understanding, has got to grips with what's required? Is that, if you like, you mentioned obviously the GPUs, but in terms of the data center infrastructure, is it ready? Is it AI ready, if you like, or are we still waiting for certain things to happen to make sure that the data center infrastructure isn't a bit of a bottleneck in this overall process?
I have to confess, AI ready is not a term I particularly like, although I do appreciate it's difficult at the moment for data center operators to explain in a simple way what they are doing or what they have done to prepare themselves for this different type of use case. So AI ready is this sort of catch-all, right? We've seen it in consumer products as well, right? HD ready before HD actually arrived in TVs, for example. So it's not necessarily a great term to use because, again, people use it as a label to mean many different things. And I think one thing that is common in terms of where people use that label is where they have designed in the ability to some extent to deal with much higher density racks. And more often than not, those higher density racks require some sort of closely coupled liquid cooling, whether that is cooling to the chip or immersion cooling. And there's lots of different sort of sub-flavors of both of those. But that's generally what is under the term AI ready. So you're saying, well, I have enabled in my data center, or I've designed into my new data center to some extent an ability to put much higher density racks in. So, if you take, I don't know, 10 to 12 kilowatts as a very rough average consumption across, let's say, the entire market at the moment, people are talking, 10 times that, right? So 120 watts, 150 watts, in some cases up to 300 kilowatts per rack. So much, much higher density, which then inevitably requires this closely coupled liquid cooling. So that's what people are generally talking about. There are many other aspects that come into play. And I think the market is, the industry is still grappling with, well, what does this really mean? What will these AI racks or GPU racks look like? Will they be entirely water cooled? Can we submerge them? Will they be partially water cooled, but still have some components that require air cooling? How many of them will there be? Are we just talking about a small fraction of a larger footprint? Or are we talking about 80, 90% of the racks in a facility will require this? There's still a lot of questions than there are answers right now.
And in terms of legacy data centers, of which there are obviously the vast majority compared to the new builds, which can be designed specifically for AI workloads. I mean, are the legacy data centers doomed to not really be able to play in the AI space, or and therefore carry on doing the normal inverted commas applications, or do they have potential opportunities to upgrade? Or, as someone explained to me, if you're going to have a legacy facility, are you going to have like one little cabinet of servers in the middle of the facility because that's the only way, the power and the cooling, that's the only way you can do it? Or is that a bit of an exaggeration?
Well, yes and no. And look, there are many different flavors of legacy data center out there. And I think the answer is somewhat a bit of a devil in the detail situation. So if you look at, let's say, the legacy data centers in Europe, for example, where it was more common, and I'm going to use some generalizations here. I think it was more common in Europe that the legacy data centers used mechanical cooling, had chilled water circuits, and with that as the sort of fundamental cooling mechanism of a data center, it's possible to see the opportunity to adapt, enhance, retrofit those types of data centers to be able to provide that liquid coolant in smaller forms, to these higher density racks. Now, could you convert an entire data center that has mechanical chillers and crack units into something that now provides a higher temperature chilled water circuit? That's a big upgrade. And that's where you would start thinking, well, does it make sense to reinvest that much capital into a facility to entirely convert it? Probably not. But to convert a proportion of it, yes, quite probably. And in fact, it's an opportunity to an extent for some of those legacy data centers to drive up their utilization, to be able to use space that otherwise, doesn't fit traditional racks, areas of the physical real estate of the data center. I was having a conversation just last night, actually. There are areas of a data center of a colleague I was talking to that are just the wrong dimensions to be usefully deployed in a sort of traditional air-cooled, lower density rack. But actually, if you put one of these immersion cooling solutions, which is almost like a rack laid on its back, right? So you don't have a height challenge where you have the height of the rack and then you have the cables above the rack and you require a sort of minimum height solution. If you have an area of a data center that has a constraint, well, most of the immersion solutions are almost like bathtubs, right? They're long and flat rather than tall and high. And if you have stranded power in a data center, but you don't have the space to put traditional air-cooled racks in, then you could utilize that stranded power in an immersion type. So there are opportunities. I don't think this renders all the legacy data centers immediately redundant. There will be, and there already are, new companies out there designing specifically for the GPU demand, who will obviously claim that, yes, you can't put this in any type of legacy data center. But that's not the case. There's going to be a good section of those legacy sites that can be adapted, can be upgraded. So yeah, I don't think it's going to be a binary situation for them.
And data sovereignty, we come onto that, and again, I'm sure we could have a long and separate conversation on the intricacies of that. So, as I understand it, it seems to me that a lot of organizations, rather than really get into the details and understand, almost take a safety first policy and kind of say, okay, we can't move this data that far. But then if you're using the cloud to a large extent, you potentially don't know where your data is. So, as I say, we haven't got a long time, but can you summarize, I suppose, the nuances of data sovereignty? Obviously, industry specific regulations, government regulations, depending on, who owns the data, etc. Just, I mean, would your recommendation be to people really, get into the nuts and bolts to understand what you can and can't do with your data, and therefore your data center options, or is safety first just a good backstop position? Just your thoughts, I suppose.
Yeah, I think let me answer that in the context of Europe, because again, as we mentioned earlier, the industry tends to follow the early development in the US, then comes to Europe, and then typically a period of time after moves on into Asia. And one of the challenges that tends to happen, and has happened in other cases before around data sovereignty, is that it's easy to mistake if you're not familiar with Europe, particularly when you look at it from a European Union perspective, to just class the whole of Europe as one country from a data sovereignty perspective. And to some extent with GDPR, you can do that. But each of the member states has the ability to implement their own elements on top or alongside the sort of core GDPR requirements. And therefore you've really got to look at Europe carefully in terms of when you are planning, well, where might I place the data physically in a jurisdiction, and who might I be able to serve from that, and who might I not be able to serve from that? It's not obvious to say, if I put everything in Dublin because it's in the EU, that solves for all data sovereignty use cases in Germany, because that's not going to be the case. So I think it is, again, a topic that the devil is in the details, particularly in Europe, and people should really do their homework, before making decisions where you're literally pouring concrete into the ground. And that is where the data is going to reside for your customers.
And in terms of the customers, as I understand it, most of the cloud providers, I'm not sure they necessarily at this moment in time can guarantee a country specific location. But I think regional, you can be fairly confident that you can, they're using a cloud within Europe or the States. Do you think that the cloud providers are going to have to get much more granular to help this process, so that if people want to continue using the cloud providers are pretty much going to have to guarantee, yes, your data can be, in location A or B or whatever? Is that got to happen?
Yes, definitely. And most of them, if not all of them, have already announced various solutions to that, various intents around that. So whether it be what a number of them call sovereign clouds, so they put infrastructure into a sovereign location with the intent of servicing that jurisdiction, or whether it's product. So there are I think everybody's familiar with the term availability zone when it comes to clouds. One particular hyperscaler uses a term local zone, and that's one of the sort of products that allows them to deal with at least an element of the data sovereignty, without needing to put a massive cloud region in every European country to satisfy each country's specific additional requirements. So I think through a mix of product and a mix of the broader strategy for the deployment of the clouds infrastructure within Europe, they all have publicly stated intent to enhance the ability for certainly those in Europe to take advantage of certainty around where their data resides.
And is that clearly, compared to perhaps the AI build out, maybe isn't that huge, but is it still a significant expansion of more local data centers, whether the hyperscalers, cloud providers build themselves, or, as they often do, take space in a co-location or co-location facilities?
Yes, absolutely. And again, it's a mixture of extending in sort of a hub and spoke like methodology for some cloud providers on their existing availability zones, and for others literally creating net new sovereign clouds with new data centers, new interconnecting networks, new local offices, new local people, the all the way to sort of true sovereign residency and access of everyone to that infrastructure, sort of again in that sovereign jurisdiction. So that's obviously a very big commitment to essentially build, if you like, a parallel cloud that you can say, yes, all of the data centers, all of the networks, all of the people working on this are within that sovereign jurisdiction. But certainly some of them have stated that intent already.
And all of what we've described, I'm guessing, I mean, it's no secret the data center industry is quite a vibrant one, but it's putting extra pressure on potential locations, with power availability, I guess, being important as well as the actual land. So are we seeing a bit of a bum fight between sort of, I don't know, property companies, the data center owners, operators, investors? Is anyone winning? Are they all working together, or is there fierce competition to try and identify and acquire sites, whether it's for the big AI projects or these sovereign clouds? Just how does that landscape look?
Yeah, I mean, there is I think it is a very competitive market. There are a lot of eyes out there locally, nationally, regionally, around looking for locations that might suit future developments. There's the sort of obvious tier one core markets in Europe, Frankfurt, London, Amsterdam, Paris, Dublin, all have their challenges, all are constrained. The tier two markets in Europe are developing, partly because of that, partly because of the proximity effect as well. So yes, there is a lot of competition, but I think it is an area that also there is a fair amount of collaboration around. And I think, actually in the US, there's probably a little bit to learn from some of the larger developments that we've seen taking place in the US, where you have a number of different operators collaborating on a much larger scheme together, where there maybe one sort of super campus, if you like, and then a number of operators within that super campus with their own mini campuses. Now, that's easier to do in the US, given the space available in some of their states. And I don't think you're going to see that anywhere near Frankfurt or Paris or Amsterdam, but I could quite see a sort of European-sized version of that developing in new market areas in Europe for solving those problems.
Yeah, and it does seem that the data center locations become more nuanced, as you say. You've obviously got the core markets, which once upon a time, I guess almost everyone thought, well, I've got to be in London, Paris, Amsterdam, whatever, just have to be. And now people are understanding that for many applications, speed, millisecond here or there really doesn't actually matter. So we're seeing like the Nordics growing in size. So do you think that's a trend that's just likely to continue because of the availability of power, costs? Just generally, it makes a lot of sense for a lot of companies to, once they've got over the hurdle that their data center isn't just down the road from where they are.
Yeah, I think it is a natural evolution of the market. Not everybody can go to the Nordics, right? Not everybody can go to an otherwise unknown, isolated location and say, right, I'm going to turn this into a data center hub. Connectivity, while latency perhaps is not necessarily as critical as it first appeared when we first started talking about edge data centers. That doesn't mean you can just go, to the middle of nowhere and say, well, I have a great source of power here and I have land available here, but there's nothing in the way of connectivity, right? It's not possible for most enterprise customers to consider digging their own fiber, or paying for a long haul fiber business or a telco to connect up a site, particularly with redundant connections where there's no fiber nearby at all. And the Nordics, is one good example of that. But if you are a hyperscaler, right, and you're building out in the hundreds of megawatts, and you have the customer base and you have the capital, then going to the middle of nowhere where power may be available and bringing the network to you is something that is achievable and indeed has been done and shown many times. Again, Nordics being a good example of that. The question I think in my mind is, does the rest of the market follow to some of those locations that the hyperscalers, particularly with their own builds, develop? There are operators out there that have taken a similar position, right? They've gone somewhere completely off market, as I would refer to it, and developed it because it had all the attributes. But typically those locations have some sort of network attribute to them as well, right? They might be by a cable landing station, for some sort of transcontinental subsea network. And those become obvious points to look at. Well, can I build a data center campus in proximity? Marseille is obviously a great example of that. Barcelona is an example of that. I think Lisbon's becoming or will become an example of that. But network is still obviously important. You can't have an isolated data center without the network. So that's one of the sort of limiting factors. And depending on who you are, I think it'll be a case of, for some time to come, we will probably follow the self-builds of the hyperscalers until some of the really larger sort of partnership and multi-tenant campuses start thinking about doing a similar thing as well.
Okay, and maybe just before we finish, we've talked a lot about AI, obviously, and data center location. Are there any other sort of key trends that you see? I don't know, legislation keeps getting brought to everyone's attention. When's it coming? How's it going to impact? I think you mentioned the German, but I think the EU Energy Efficiency Act is out there. So is that going to have an impact? And I guess more generally, sustainability is still sort of front and center for a lot of people. So are we going to see anything there? I mean, there's a lot of companies committed to net zero by even 2030, which isn't that far away. Just, I suppose, your thoughts as to what else might be concerning the industry at the moment.
I mean, those really are the key topics. Sustainability, I believe, for everybody now in this market, is no longer just a talking point, is no longer just a token contribution point. It has to be core. You have to have that as a core thread to your business thesis. If you're a data center operator, you have to have it as a core part of the investment strategy. You have to have it as a core part of the differentiator, to other operators. It's a core part of attracting the right clients. Again, if you're a third-party operator, to your sites and locations. And it's ever increasingly challenging, partly because of the legislation, which keeps ramping up around us, as it were. So the challenge of, for example, reducing greenhouse gas emissions from certain coolant types that are used, in gases in chillers, is a challenge. Put that together with the requirement to operate at higher and higher levels of efficiency, but ensuring you don't use water, because there are many places, including even northern parts of Germany, that are water constrained. It's not just Madrid. So it provides a smaller and smaller space within which to figure out where you go from a location perspective, how you solve for those constraints, and how you ensure the data center still represents a great long-term investment, because at the end of the day, there's a significant amount of capital that goes into to getting a data center live and then operating it over its lifetime. Indeed, this is infrastructure investment that is attracted. And it is a challenge to deal with not just the constraints of today, but the constraints we know are coming, and ensure again that this is something that represents a good long-term investment. Now, that's still very much the case, which is why this sector enjoys the capital it requires to build at the speed that demand is challenging us with. But it will become harder and harder, and those elements of sustainability and renewable energy generation and considering things adjacent, not just on the consumption side, but also generation, local generation, whether that's the discussion around small modular nuclear reactors or on-site renewables in terms of solar or energy storage. All of these things are going to become critical to the long-term success of any data center.
And maybe just finally, because I've taken up a lot of your time, for which I'm very grateful. Do you think that at some point AI, with its demands for more power and more space and sustainability, are they on a sort of collision path and something has to give? Or do you think the industry has the tools and the will to ensure that AI, the explosion, which we're talking about, no one quite knows that, will be managed in a sustainable way? Or will we just inevitably have to say, if you want AI, then you're just going to have to kind of allow data centers to be slightly less sustainable than they might otherwise have been? What are your thoughts?
Maybe a tongue-in-cheek response first. Maybe we should ask AI if it's that good. Let's ask AI to come up with the solution for housing itself. And say that somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but again, I'm amazed on a daily basis with the responses I get to my questions that I ask the various AI applications I have. But no, I think the solutions are there. There are challenges, I think, mostly related to the legacy grid infrastructure, right? So we are challenged certainly in Europe, I think to some extent in the US as well, with being able to get the power from where it is generated, particularly those sustainably generated sources, right? Whether that's on offshore wind or solar, to the places where it's consumed. I think storage, energy storage, again, is an area that there is a lot of work being done in, whether that's through batteries or thermal storage in terms of the molten salts or graphite thermal storage. There are lots of technologies out there and many of them have been used in other industries. So I think we still have a long runway ahead of us in the data center market to bring these technologies and this knowledge from adjacent sectors together to make a much more sustainable environment or ecosystem around the data center. I don't see us necessarily reaching the end of the road and having a calamity where we just say, well, throw our hands up in the air. We don't know how we're going to solve this. There's a lot of smart people working on almost every aspect of this on a daily basis, and I think it's something the industry will grapple with successfully. Okay,
I mean, it's been brilliant to chat. Some fascinating insights into what's going on. So I just really appreciate the time you give me. Thanks very much, Zahl. Thank you.
No problem. Thanks so much for the opportunity for that.
Thanks again.